Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Youth Ledger. I'm your host, Shiven Diwakar, and in today's episode, we're unpacking the biggest global and economic headlines from the past week. This includes rising tensions between Israel and Iran, how the markets responded, central bank uncertainty, and unrest here in the US and abroad. Let's jump right in. So first, let's talk about the Middle East. But before we do that, let's review our historical knowledge in the region, shall we? The conflict between Iran and the West, particularly the US and Israel, over nuclear capabilities is deeply rooted in a century of geopolitics, and this stretches back to the early 20th century when foreign powers first vied for the control of Iran's vast oil reserves. After the CIA-backed overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, the US installed a Shah, whose authoritarian regime was deeply unpopular. Following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran's new theocratic leadership severed ties with the West and adopted a confrontational stance, especially towards the US and Israel. Iran's nuclear ambitions emerged in the 1980s, initially under the guise of civilian energy development. However, by the early 2000s, suspicions grew that Iran was pursuing weapons-grade uranium, which prompted UN sanctions and global alarms. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, traded nuclear limits for economic relief, but the US withdrew in 2018, leading to reignited tensions. Since then, Iran has resumed enrichment, while Israel has repeatedly vowed to prevent Iran from ever obtaining a nuclear weapon, allegedly sabotaging facilities and targeting scientists. Now back to the present. Over the last week, tensions between Israel and Iran hit a boiling point. Iran responded to US airstrikes, which reportedly targeted nuclear facilities, by launching missiles at US military bases in Qatar and Iraq. This response has heightened fears of a broader regional war. Another of the most alarming developments has been that Iran's parliament voted to close the Strait of Hormuz. That's the waterway which through about 20% or 1/5 of the world's oil travels. While it's not officially closed yet, as it still requires final approval from Iran's Supreme Council, just the possibility of that action has sent global markets scrambling. In Tehran, people began panic buying gasoline, even though there wasn't an actual shortage. And that panic tells us something deeper. When institutions feel shaky, consumer behavior changes fast. Okay, so a lot has changed between when I wrote this script and when I'm recording. Yesterday evening, the 23rd of June, President Trump posted on his social media platform Truth Social, declaring that a ceasefire had been agreed to between Israel and Iran. This didn't age very well, as soon after, or today morning, Israel accused Iran of launching more missiles and vowed to retaliate. Trump then stepped in, lashing out at both sides, claiming that they, and I quote, don't know what the F they're doing, unquote. He also insisted that the ceasefire is still in effect, so we'll just have to wait and see if that's really true. Naturally, oil prices responded to all of this. Brent crude jumped nearly 4%, reaching around $80 a barrel, while West Texas Intermediate followed suit. Analysts at Morgan Stanley warned that if the Strait of Hormuz is actually closed, oil could spike to $100 to $110 a barrel. These numbers were before the ceasefire were announced. Nonetheless, oil isn't just what we put into our Ford F-150s. It contributes to food costs, transportation, and electricity. The markets know this, which is why the S&P and global indexes dipped slightly midweek before bouncing back when it became clear that Iran's retaliation didn't include tanker traffic. Personally, I doubt that Iran will close the Strait of Hormuz, as it's not really in their own economic interest. About 80 to 90% of Iran's own exports, especially crude oil and petroleum products, rely on the strait. Shutting it down would cut off billions in revenue. So while the threat plays well for domestic politics and posturing, a full blockade would likely hurt Iran more than anybody else in the long run. Now, let's zoom out to see how central banks reacted. The US Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, and Bank of England all decided to keep rates steady this past week. Why? Well, inflation is still lurking, and the last thing anyone wants is to loosen monetary policy while oil prices surge. Fed Chair Jerome Powell gave testimony this week, and while his tone was cautious, he made it clear. Geopolitical instability adds uncertainty. Nonetheless, he claimed that the US economy was in a, and I quote, solid position, unquote. Adding to the economic anxiety, the World Bank issued a warning that this year's global growth outlook is the weakest since the 2008 financial crisis. Even at the G7 summit, leaders admitted the global economy is slowing, despite their push for deeper trade ties. The world seems to be facing a double bind, needing global trade more than ever, but also more afraid than ever of the risks tied to it. So, to wrap up, this week showed us just how tightly bound global security, energy markets, inflation, and political stability really are. It's all connected, and as students, citizens, or just thoughtful observers, we cannot afford to ignore it. Thank you all for tuning into this deep dive of the week's biggest developments. If you found this episode insightful, subscribe and follow. Their TikTok and YouTube pages are now up, so take a look at those as well. And as always, please share your thoughts below. Signing out, this is Shiven Diwakar. See you next time on the Youth Ledger.